Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I'd like to welcome all of you and our good friends from C-SPAN to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson. I'm the Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, as well as the public program producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we start today's program, I just have a couple of brief announcements. I hope you'll join us on Wednesday, March 4th at noon. William G. Hyland will present a talk on his book, Martha Jefferson, An Intimate Life with Thomas Jefferson. This is the first and only biography on the life of Martha Jefferson, who died an untimely death at the age of 33. On Friday, March 6th, the National Archives Museum will open its newest exhibit, Spirited Republic, Alcohol in American History. To launch this new exhibit opening, we will have a special noon author talk that day called Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking by journalist and author Mark Will Weber. Spirited Republic will run through January 4th of 2016. To find out more about these and our other public programs and exhibits, you can take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is A Chosen Exile, A History of Racial Passing in American Life by Allyson Hobbs. Allyson Hobbs is an assistant professor in the history department at Stanford University. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University and received her, Harvard University, and she received a PhD with distinction from the University of Chicago. She has received fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the Michelle R. Clayman Institute for Gender Research, and the Center for Comparative Study of Race and Ethnicity at Stanford. Allyson teaches courses on American identity, African American history, African American women's history, and 20th century American history. She has won numerous teaching awards, including the Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Prize, the Graves Award in the Humanities, and the St. Clair Drake Teaching Award. She gave a TEDx talk at Stanford. She has appeared on C-SPAN and National Public Radio, and her work has been featured on CNN.com, Slate.com, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. A Chosen Exile, A History of Racial Passing in American Life is Allyson's first book. It has been featured on National Public Radio's All Things Considered, the Tavis Smiley Show on Public Radio International, and the Madison Show on Sirius XM. The book was selected as a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, a Best Book of 2014 by the San Francisco Chronicle, and a Book of the Week by the Times Higher Education in London. The Root named A Chosen Exile as one of the best 15 nonfiction books by Black authors in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Allyson Hobbs to the National Archives.
Well, thank you so much, Douglas, for such a lovely and generous introduction. My sincere thanks to Douglas for inviting me to come to the National Archives. It's such a pleasure being in this beautiful city with such a rich history. And thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I'm very eager to hear your questions and your comments. So let me begin with the inspiration behind this project. This project was inspired by a story that my aunt told me about a distant cousin who grew up on the south side of Chicago in the 1930s. This story begins with a parade, the historic Bud Billiken Parade, an annual parade that continues to this day. On a sizzling summer morning in August, my cousin leapt from her bed to find the best spot to view the parade. She joined a crowd that numbered in the thousands, and she cheered as drum majors, baton twirlers, and celebrities in convertibles passed by. She ran out to the floats to touch the parade's anointed king and queen and caught the candy that the participants tossed to her. The parade was a South Side institution, and at a time when racial tensions ran high, when Black families squeezed into overcrowded kitchenettes, and when Black children knew not to venture beyond the boundaries of their neighborhood, The Bud Billiken Parade evoked a deep sense of race pride, community, and togetherness. For one day a year, Black children could imagine that the city of Chicago was all theirs. Now, our cousin could not have known that this would be her last time hearing the marching bands and the cheering crowds. Unlike many Black parents, she would not share this experience with her children. She was Black, but she looked white. She was very light-skinned. And at the insistence of her mother, after she graduated from high school, she would move far away from Chicago's South Side to Los Angeles to live the rest of her life as a white woman. It was not her choice. She pleaded with her mother. She did not want to leave her family, her friends, and the only life that she had ever known. But her mother was determined, and the matter was decided. Years later, after she married a white man and raised white children who knew nothing of her past, she received a very inconvenient telephone call. It was her mother, and she was calling to tell her that her father was dying and that she must come home immediately. Despite these dire circumstances, she would never return to Chicago's South Side. The young girl who had once sat on a curb in Chicago's most historic Black neighborhood to watch America's largest Black parade was a white woman now, and there was simply no turning back. After my aunt told me this story, it stuck with me. It wouldn't leave me alone. So I have spent the last 10 years wrestling with this curious phenomenon of passing. Conventional wisdom tells us that a history of passing cannot be written, that those who passed left no trace in the historical record, and that only novelists, playwrights, and poets could write about this clandestine and hidden practice. But I believed that the sources were out there for historians, just waiting to be discovered. So I went into the archives looking for ghosts, hoping to tell their stories. To find these ghosts, historians must seek out unconventional stories that vary at different historical moments. In each era, Americans produced new sets of unexpected sources, from runaway slave advertisements to diary entries, from newspaper accounts to laws designed to preserve racial integrity and police the one-drop rule, from students' records at colleges and universities to articles in popular magazines. The sources on passing are abundant, but often found in unlikely places. These sources make plain that passing was generally an egalitarian practice. Elites tended to have greater access to resources and opportunities to pass, but given the right circumstances, the poor could cross over too. Men tended to enjoy greater mobility in American society, but under particular conditions, women passed almost effortlessly. These sources revealed passing to be a deeply individualistic practice, but also a fundamentally social act with enormous social consequences. The iconic image of the heartbroken yet sympathetic Black mother who must not speak a word nor lay eyes upon her white-looking child in public lays bare the painful consequences of this practice. A history of passing cannot be written without telling her story too. Passing was often an intentionally or involuntarily collaborative endeavor. Family members, friends, neighbors, and coworkers were often affected and sometimes implicated in this practice. Those who were left behind described the pain and the loss of this act just as keenly as those who passed. To pass as white meant to lose a sense of embeddedness in a community. For many family members and friends of those who passed, racial identity came to mean much more than an individual's rejection of the race. It meant no longer belonging as a family member and no longer sharing experiences, stories, and memories of times past. Passing is often represented as a story of gain. By passing as white, particularly during the years of legalized segregation, one could access a range of employment opportunities that would be otherwise restricted. One could live in a better neighborhood, and one could enjoy countless social privileges, like sitting in a more comfortable seat on a train or being addressed as Mr. or Mrs., respectful titles reserved for white men and women only. But my cousin's story made me realize that to write a history of passing is to write a history of loss. The goal of my work is to explore not only what was gained by passing as white, but also what was lost by walking away from a Black identity. Racial passing is an exile, sometimes chosen, sometimes not. From the late 18th century to the present, racially ambiguous men and women have wrestled with complex questions about the conditions of their times, and they have fashioned complex understandings about their places in the world. Over these 2 centuries, countless African Americans passed as white, leaving behind families, friends, communities, and roots. Lives were lost only to be remembered in family stories like mine. My book is an effort to recover those lives. I join scholars who have argued that race is socially constructed and performative, but I keep my eye on what race and racial identity mean to those who are racialized. Rather than seeing racial identity from the racial regime looking down on those who passed as white, I bring into focus what passers saw when they looked out onto their own worlds. Race was quite real to those who lived with it, not because of skin color or essentialist notions about biology, but because it was social and experiential, because it involved one's closest relationships and one's most intimate communities. Let me take a step back now and offer broader historical context to this project. Racial passing in the United States is the focus of my project, but it must be acknowledged as only a subset of a much larger phenomenon that encompasses multiple disguises and forms of dissemblance. In the 19th century, as young men and women steadily migrated out of small towns to seek their fortunes in America's booming cities, American Victorians warned that these men and women might pass and enter higher social classes to which they did not belong, given the fluidity of early 19th century America. While American Victorians were fretting over class passing, Jewish applicants changed their names to outmaneuver discriminatory admissions policies that limited enrollments at universities such as Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Chinese immigrants disguised themselves to pass as Mexicans and enter the U.S. from the U.S.-Mexico border during the era when Chinese were excluded from immigrating to the United States. In 1907, a U.S. government investigation discovered these photographs attached to fraudulent Mexican citizenship papers. Loretta Vasquez, a Cuban-born woman, passed as a Confederate soldier to fight in the Civil War and entered the ranks of numerous women who joined the military or participated in occupations and activities restricted to men. Gay men passed as straight, also known as putting their hair up, married women, and worked in professions that would have been unavailable to them if they had, quote, let their hair down. And Mez Mesro, the flamboyant jazz saxophonist born to Russian Jewish immigrants, passed as Black to shore up his musical credentials. Here I have identified only a handful of examples of a sweeping phenomenon to demonstrate its flexibility and its adaptability to various historical contexts. The poor passed as the rich, women passed as men, Jews passed as Gentiles, gay men and women passed as straight, and whites sometimes passed as black. And of course, the reverse of each of these dyads was plausible given specific conditions and circumstances. Particularly in societies with relatively open and fluid social orders, the permutations on passing were endless. Now let me give you a brief overview of my book, which spans the late 18th to the mid-20th centuries. The lived experience of passing, the act of negotiating the permeable border between black and white, reveals one way that everyday people have interacted with a racist society since the late 18th century. Each era determined not only how racially ambiguous men and women lived, but also what they lost. In the antebellum period, enslaved men and women lived with a looming threat of loss, knowing that they could be bought, sold, and forever separated from their families if their master lost a card game or decided to present a slave as a wedding gift. During the era of slavery, to pass as white was to escape, not necessarily from blackness, but from slavery, often with the intention of recovering precious relationships and living as black under the more secure conditions of freedom. Passing as white became possible in a society where whiteness was not based solely on appearance, but also on dress, behavior, and mannerisms. Indeed, skin color and physical appearance were usually the least reliable factors. Racially ambiguous slaves drew on highly sophisticated understandings of racial, gender, and social norms to enact whiteness, and by doing so, many successfully passed to freedom. Ellen Craft passed as a white man, crossing both racial and gender lines to escape to freedom, while her darker-skinned husband played the role of her slave. It was necessary for Ellen to pass as a man because she knew it was highly unconventional for a white woman to travel alone with a male slave. But the Crafts' convincing performance required far more than Ellen's white skin. It was Ellen's knowledge of how to dress and comport herself like a Southern gentleman, and her subtle and nuanced understandings of Southern social and gender norms that made this daring undertaking a marvelous success. Concerned that her beardless face might betray her, or that her illiteracy would prevent her from registering her name at hotels, Ellen became a master of improvisation. She bound her right hand in a sling so that she could ask others to sign her name for her. She bandaged her face so that no one would know that she did not have a beard. By feigning illness, disability, and even deafness, Ellen politely excused herself from conversation and won the sympathy of other travelers. In fact, Ellen played the role of a Southern gentleman so well that white Southern ladies reportedly swooned in her presence. Passing to freedom, however, was not nearly as laden with the moral questions and experiences with loss that would follow in later years. During the long years of Jim Crow, passing meant striking out on one's own and leaving behind a family and a people. Without a doubt, benefits accrued to these new white identities. But a more complete understanding of this practice requires a reckoning with the loss, alienation, and isolation that accompanied and often outweighed its rewards. During the Jim Crow period, the period between 1890 and 1955, segregated living and working arrangements created the necessary conditions for passing to flourish, but also for this practice to undermine Black families and communities. This period also witnessed the Great Migration, the massive and unprecedented migrations of African Americans out of the South. These migrations allowed racially ambiguous people to travel and to try on new identities in the anonymity of northern cities. One woman described her grandmother's journey from Mississippi to Chicago. Once in Chicago and no longer immediately identifiable as Lula's daughter, her grandmother could easily enter the white world. When she presented herself for work in Chicago's all-white retail district, no one ever asked if she was Black. The question was unthinkable. Unwritten codes of racial decorum in the fine establishment where she worked prevented such scrutiny. This was one of the most common forms of passing during the Jim Crow era, working white while living Black. 9-to-5 passing, as it was often called, allowed nearly white men and women to access employment slated for whites only. Simply mentioning that a family member held a white-collar job became shorthand for passing as white, given the strict segregation of employment opportunities. A woman wrote of a relative who was, quote, working up in New York State, passing as the head manager of the largest paper factory in the country. Family members signaled that a relative had a high-paying job by stating that he or she works as white, and it could be assumed that a relative was passing if he or she worked in a particular field or in an all-white establishment. Henry Park was the only colored fireman in New Haven, one family member bragged, adding, he neglected to tell them he was Negro. Others conceded, I never tried to pass. Folks thought that I was white and I didn't enlighten them. The constructed nature of race becomes evident when individuals change their racial identity by changing location, clothing, speech, and life story, thus seemingly making themselves white. Others pass temporarily or situationally to seek respite from Jim Crow living every now and then. In a 1932 letter to Carl Van Vechten, novelist Nella Larson wrote about passing as white in the company of Grace Nail Johnson, James Weldon Johnson's light-skinned wife. And I'll read her letter for you. You will be much amused that I, who have never tried this much-discussed passing stunt, have waited until I reached the Deep South to put it over. Grace Johnson and I drove about 50 miles south of here the other day and then walked to the best restaurant in a rather conservative town called Murfreesboro and demanded lunch and got it, plus all the service in the world and an invitation to return. Everybody here seems to think that quite a stunt. Larson's letter reveals the type of momentary passing that became commonplace during the Jim Crow era, but it also reveals the fun and the theatrics of passing. Convincing performances required gumption, resourcefulness, and no small measure of humor. The sheer joy of getting over and fooling our white folks, as Langston Hughes put it, made passing a means of poking fun at a racial system laden with absurdities about racial purity. Walter White, the racially ambiguous executive secretary of the NAACP, made a practice of putting his blonde hair and blue eyes to use to enter the South during the 1930s to investigate lynching. White must have laughed nervously when he sat next to a white man on a train who bragged that he had special expertise in identifying blacks who passed as white. Taking White's hand into his own and pointing at White's cuticles, the man explained that if White had black blood, it would show on his fingernails, an antiquated belief about a telltale sign of Black racial identity. In a country obsessed with racial distinctions, passing demonstrated just how unreliable one's appearance was in determining their race. At times, passing was a practical joke at the expense of whites, but this levity must not obscure the work that passing does on more intimate registers, laying bare the high emotional stakes, the threats to family coherence, and the personal dislocations that this practice necessitated. In a memoir of her mother, Ronnie Hartfield, a mixed-race woman, reflected on the expansive sense of Black family feeling and wrote, "It is said that colored people all over the world will ask each other upon first meeting, 'Who are your people?' This question signals the importance of locating Black individuals within larger familial networks and sets of kinfolk. Hartfield's mother had lived on both sides of the color line. In Chicago, she held a well-paying job at the Automatic Electric Company. She did not volunteer any information about her racial background, and none of her coworkers, recent immigrants from Italy, Lithuania, and Poland, asked any questions. As her daughter explained, this was the kind of tacit passing that allowed her mother to gain a foothold in Chicago in the 19-teens. Despite her mother's practice of 9-to-5 passing, she could not make sense of the familial dislocations that permanent passing required. As she explained, in slavery days, people got cut off from their families, but there was nothing they could do about it. But these passing people who choose to do that, I can't make any sense out of that at all. All they get in return for giving up everything is people can think they're white. People think I'm white anyway, and I don't feel any different. I have my family and my true history. That means something." Shepard's family relationships and her true history were more meaningful than the privileges of looking white. Passing meant letting go of one's people, or as Shepard lamented, of giving up any thoughts of ever seeing one's colored family again, something that she could never conceive of. As she asked, how would anybody know who they were without their people? To Shepard's mind, letting go of one's people was nothing less than letting go of oneself. Let me conclude with one of the most heart-wrenching stories of passing that I discovered in the archives. This is a story of a woman named Elsie Roxborough. Elsie Roxborough was born to a storied African-American family, and she chose to pass as white after she graduated from the University of Michigan in 1937. And this is a picture of her during her freshman year at Michigan. Her story ends in tragedy. She took her own life in 1949. During the Depression, the Roxborough family lived a life that few Americans, white or Black, could imagine. They had maids and chauffeurs. Elsie rode horses and drove her father's cars. The family vacationed with other Blacks at Idlewild, a lakefront resort in western Michigan nicknamed the Black Eden. As one family friend explained, we knew things were bad, but not for our crowd. We knew people sold apples on street corners, but we wore white linen jackets to Sunday school. Elsie was tall and slender, glamorous and vivacious. She had a beauty and charm that few men, Black or white, could resist. Langston Hughes admired her. Her classmate, the future playwright Arthur Miller, called her a beauty, the classiest girl in Ann Arbor. Langston Hughes wrote that Elsie would tell him her dreams and wonder whether or not it would be better for her to pass as white to achieve them. After graduating from college in 1937, Elsie moved to California and passed to work as a model and a screenwriter. When her fortunes ran dry out west, Elsie moved east. In New York, she dyed her brown hair red and dropped the famous Roxborough name to become the unattached white Mona Manet. But even as a white woman, her dreams would never come true. And here's a picture of her when she was passing as white in New York. Langston Hughes was in Spain when Elsie wrote him to tell him that she had decided to pass. For several years, Elsie wrote letters to Hughes and sent him gifts at Christmas without a return address on the package. In time, Elsie's letters and gifts stopped altogether, and Hughes never heard from her again. When Elsie's white roommate returned from a weekend trip, she found Elsie in her bed. It appeared that she had committed suicide. Her sister, who could also pass as white, traveled to New York with the wrenching assignment of claiming the body. The arrival of this ostensibly white woman allowed Elsie to remain white even in death. Elsie had written to her father for financial help. He refused her, and 3 days later, she was dead. Her sister would never speak to her father again. By the 1940s and through the 1960s, personal testimonies began to declare that the losses were simply too much to bear, and it was time to give up passing and come home. The Black press published numerous testimonials of African Americans who disavowed passing and cataloged countless psychological advantages of embracing a Black identity. Many articles cheerfully announced the collapse of economic barriers after World War II that seemed to make 9-to-5 passing no longer necessary. Other essays focused on the collective pride that African Americans experienced and the growing protest spirit of the burgeoning civil rights movement. The Johnston family, shown here in their suburban home in Keene, New Hampshire, passed for 20 years before they were discovered. The father, a successful and well-respected radiologist, applied to be an officer in the Navy during World War II. A naval background check revealed that he had been in a Black fraternity during college. Now, note to self, if you're thinking about passing, probably best not to join a Black fraternity. But after the family's secret was revealed, they insisted that they were through with passing and that they would never pass again. By the 1960s, racial politics had changed once again. Black identities were affirmed and passing was rejected. Black was beautiful. Blending in with the white world seemed no longer economically necessary, politically advantageous, or socially desirable. I am often asked, do people still pass today? I am certain that passing continues, but probably in a very different form than what I have described in my talk. We now live in a far more multiracial society than Ellen Craft or Elsie Roxborough could have ever imagined. The conditions of the 21st century allow for a greater acceptance of mixed race identities, but still the core issues of race and identity remain. Each generation must navigate the social currents and racial realities of their time period. A history of passing opens a window on the complexity of the human experience. It allows us to gain a deeper and more meaningful understanding of the ways that race is lived and experienced. I have assembled a disparate cast of characters, scenes, and settings, and moments of conflict and contradiction to knit together the history of passing. Passing offered countless freedoms, from the pleasures of sitting in more comfortable sections of movie theaters to the simple dignities of trying on a hat in a store without being compelled to buy it, to the more elusive opportunities to feel more like a man or to be treated like a lady. Passing is an enduring historical phenomenon that opens a wide window onto larger issues about fluid racial definitions, the changing dynamics of race relations, and the complex and circuitous routes along which African American identities have developed in the United States. My book attempts to reconstruct the world of passing by pairing scholarly discussions of its social, economic, and political context with the personal, emotional, and familial matter that make it human. Passing was not an automatic response to racial discrimination. Some African Americans used passing as a crucial channel leading to physical and personal freedom. They declared their rights as American citizens and insisted on their humanity. What they could not fully know until they had successfully passed was that the light of freedom was often overshadowed by the darkness of loss. Thank you. So I'd love to take questions. But yes, please.
Presentation.
Thank
Two
you.
brief, wholly unrelated questions.
Sure.
There are accounts that Warren G. Harding was
Right.
either passed or was descended from someone who did, which
Yeah.
would make Harding the first black president. And my second question,
Yeah.
were any people who passed betrayed by the children they fathered or bore?
Oh, very interesting, very interesting. Warren G. Harding is such a fascinating story because supposedly when he was running for president, this story of him actually having black ancestry really dogged him. And eventually he just said, you know, and I actually, let me try to get the quote because it's so classic. He says something like, you know, how would I know if one of my ancestors jumped the fence? So he never actually denied that he had black ancestry. He was kind of vague about it, but he certainly never denied it. So it is very likely that he was the first African-American president. And then there's been other speculation that other presidents have had, you know, African-American ancestry as well, which certainly would not be that surprising either when you think about the amount of racial mixture that there was in this country, particularly in the South. And that's why in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, there is a judge in Virginia, a judge named William Harper, and he's sort of arguing that we shouldn't make the laws too strict when it comes to what defines someone as black and what defines someone as white. And basically he says, because if we make the laws too strict, there are a lot of people who really believe themselves to be white who aren't going to pass the test. And he says, you know, it's a lot better if we let one or two people pass as white than if we really start pulling at this ball of yarn, because the whole system could easily become undone. So I think more people were aware of this than probably, you know, publicly stated it. But it does remind us of just how much racial mixture there has been in this country, and, you know, particularly in the South during the antebellum period. Your second question is also very interesting about whether the children later betrayed the parents. And I haven't read any accounts of that, though I'm sure that was possible and that happened. I guess the question would be, who would have told the children? You know, how would they have found out? Oh, sorry. Oh, yes, absolutely. Right. Yes. So there's many cases where there's this fear of what was known as the dark baby. And in literature, there are a lot of examples of women who are passing as white. They refuse to have children because they're terrified that they're going to have a dark baby. This family, the Johnstons, their story was turned into a film called Lost Boundaries that was produced in 1949. And there's a scene where the wife has her first child, and there's so much concern and angst about how the child is going to look. And then there's so much relief when the child looks white and, everything's fine. But there's also a story of a family who actually lived in Washington, D.C. in the late 19th century. They were here in the 1860s. I think through the 1870s, because the father was like a founding member of the Freedmen's Bank. And when the bank collapsed, he felt horrible and responsible. So he decides, we're going to leave town, we're going to move to Nebraska. Which I should also mention is often one of the prerequisites to passing, right? That you have to leave where you're from, where you're known, start your life over in a new place in order to be able to pass, because you can't pass where everyone knows who you are. So he decides they're going to move to Nebraska, and somewhere along the way between Washington, D.C. and Nebraska, they decide that they're going to pass as white. So they decide to pass as white. Their daughter eventually marries a white man, and they have a baby, and the physician, the attending physician, says, I can't write that this baby is white on the birth certificate because clearly this baby is not white. I don't really know what to do. It's kind of awkward. And essentially the husband, in the case, the white husband, ends up suing the wife and getting the marriage annulled and claiming that he did not know that his wife was black and was passing until the baby was born. So it's a great question, and yes, there are many, many cases, and also it's just sort of like a trope, particularly in literature, this kind of fear that eventually, and it was also sort of like a cautionary tale, kind of like you don't want to pass because you never know, a few generations down the line or even the next generation might give your secret away. So thank you for your question. Yeah, great. Yes.
You teach some interesting courses at Stanford, American Identity, African American Women's History. I'm assuming that you use the book in your courses, and if so, what are some of the responses that you get from students today who may have never known about this, and what's the most interesting response that you have heard either from students or your people who you speak to on the book?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I actually haven't taught the book yet in my classes because I like just finished writing it. But I do really enjoy talking about the phenomenon of passing with my students because they are of a very different generation. Which sometimes makes me feel very old, but I try to let go of that. But I love to show them this picture, and often in the class that I teach on racial identity, I show them this picture, and I say, how would you describe this family's racial identity? And they say, well, they're mixed race. They say they're black. They say they're Puerto Rican. They say, well, maybe they're Italian. I mean, they have a number of different responses. And when I tell them that they passed as white for 20 years, they say, oh, that's not even possible. There's no way. So, and then I explain, well, actually, they lived in New Hampshire. The fact that the father was a radiologist, the fact that the mother was kind of a consummate housewife, that she hosted the Christmas social at her home every year, and that she was a member of all of the right clubs and organizations, that their class status really played a major role in the way people understood their racial identity. And in fact, when they did come out and say that they were actually black, one of their neighbors said, we didn't know that black people could even live like this. They were so shocked because they lived a life that people assumed that only white people lived. So we talk a lot about class and a lot about the ways that class is really a determining factor in race. we also talk a lot about kind of the absurdity of racial definitions and racial categorizations. And we talk a lot about mixed race identity and about how we're now living in a very different time when a number of identities are both socially accepted and also accepted officially by the state. I mean, the fact that the census has been changed such that now people can mark one or more categories, that we've really moved into a very different period, and that it's kind of important for us to sort of think about our present moment and the kinds of opportunities that the present moment allows that really were not available during this time. I mean, during this time it was, you were either black or white. In the film, and actually in the real story, the father has a really difficult time getting an internship as a medical doctor. And supposedly a colleague of his who's white says, no one would ever know. Why don't you just pass as white? And he decides that that's what he's going to do. And then all of a sudden he has all of these great opportunities. And it sort of shows the kind of injustice and unfairness of racial discrimination. But the point being that it's not as if he could have said, well, I'm mixed race or I'm biracial. But rather that it was, you're white or black, and there really wasn't a lot of room in between. But I hope that gives you a kind of sense of the kinds of conversations that we have. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I found your book to be a very compelling read. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, there are some parts of it that just read like an exciting thriller. And I was just wondering if there's been any consideration of adapting that to a movie or a documentary. I mean, when I think about Ellen Craft, and you've also mentioned the Johnsons, those were really exciting portions of your book. So just wondering if there's any thought given to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm waiting for Steven Spielberg to call. Steve McQueen, if you're out there, you can find me on Facebook. But I mean, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that's what made studying passing so exciting, was that while it was very difficult to find some of these stories, once you find them, they really do feel like they're out of a movie, and especially the Ellen Craft story. I mean, there's all of these different moments where she and her husband they don't meet up at the right place. And, there's another moment where she's on the train and this man is really trying to talk to her, and, she's trying to feign illness and she's trying to act like she can't hear him. And, so like your heart is pounding as you're reading this story about what she's going through to try to make this disguise work. And she's very anxious about it. And, so there's a number of times where you don't really know what's going to happen. And you're sort of thinking that, this is really a desperate escape, that if anyone were to find this out, they would be back in slavery. I mean, this is a matter of, being enslaved versus being free. So I definitely think that that there are many pieces of this story that would certainly make for great television or film. And I mean, and I'm sure many of you have seen some great films about passing, Imitation of Life. There's a great film called Pinky. The film about this family, Lost Boundaries. And there are these really intense moments. There's a really sad moment in Imitation of Life, if you've seen the one from 1934, where Freddie Washington, a black actress, plays the role of the woman who's passing. And she really sort of cries out against all of the discrimination that she's facing as a black woman. She decides to pass as white, and she's working in this store. And her mother comes in because she's looking for her. And Freddie Washington gets very nervous and has to really ignore her mother and it creates this huge, heart-wrenching scene. And then, eventually her manager comes over and is wondering what's going on, and it appears that she's got this black mother, and that means that she's black, and she can't work at the store if she's black, and so there's just numerous examples that are very, very intense and sort of very moving and very powerful that I think would really translate to film very nicely. So thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks so much for your work. It's very fascinating. You noted, I was just wondering if you noted the relationship between class
Yes.
and passing.
Right.
And then also I'm wondering if you noticed the relationship between latitude and passing, i.e. Southern, much more passing versus Northern. And I suggest that because increasingly what I'm finding is that as a species, we have this propensity to sit a lot. And so wealthy people tend to sit a lot. And also I notice in Southern culture, because of heat and other factors like that, people are seated a lot. And the sitting I'm finding, having taken a lot of anatomy and physiology, actually has huge consequences to cognition. And that it's these big muscle groups that are being used when you're seated or flexed, and they're using lots of oxygen and nutrients in the blood, which is actually setting up conditions in the blood that make it so the brain is producing lots of fearful negative thoughts. I mean, that's more and more as I'm living my life and having had everything taken from me over the last 3 years, the only way I've been able to process it is through these kind of terms. And especially our culture, American culture, which is so wealthy, when you consider that great wealth and what that means in terms of how people are living, and then all the fear that seems to go with our culture. Just some thoughts.
That's fascinating. That's terrible news for me. Because I sit like all day long writing, so I'm thinking about that. But that's really fascinating. I mean, you're exactly right that class and race are completely intertwined, and particularly in these cases of passing, it's. I don't want to say it's entirely unusual or completely rare to find a case where someone who was of a lower socioeconomic status passed, because certainly under certain conditions they were able to pass. Like there's a really interesting story of this man who knows that there's a group of it's in the narrative of Henry Bibb, who's a runaway slave, and he knows that there's like a group of white alcoholics, basically drunks, who are in this town where he's going to be. So he actually passes as drunk because he can then fit in with this group. So it often just depends on, again, the kind of knowledge of the group that one wants to pass into, and being able to mimic that behavior so that they're believable as a member of that group. And that's exactly what happened in this case. I mean, in this case, as I mentioned, I mean, it was their home. You can even see it in this picture. It was the home that they lived in. They lived in the most beautiful house in Keene. They lived on the most kind of prestigious street in Keene. He was a radiologist. They had all of the accoutrements and all of the trappings of wealth and refinement and status. So that really allowed them to pass. And there's some really interesting cases where there's one case where the wife's father is in town, and he is also looks white and is able to pass. And a man comes up to him and points at his daughters. The wife is this woman is like across the room or something, and he points. He goes up to her father, not knowing that it's her father, and says, "There's a rumor that woman is black, or I think he says a mulattress, which would have been the term that they would have used at the time." So he says, "There's a rumor that woman is a mulattress. And the father just looks at him, with such indignity and says, that's absolutely not true. But of course, it's because of his stature, and it's because of the way he has this sort of power and this sort of credibility that's largely based on class. So definitely there's a lot of interconnections between class and race. And I would argue that there's also a lot of interconnections between gender and race, that she's able to pass as a white woman because she's doing the things that white women do. She's a homemaker, she's entertaining, she's a member of all the right clubs. I mean, it's all of these things that make her story believable. Same as, with Ellen Craft, it's the things that she does that make her believable as a white man, that otherwise, she wouldn't be able to pass. So in terms of regionality, I definitely think that there were more opportunities to pass in the South, particularly in the antebellum period, so like in the 1800s, just because there was much more racial mixture, and also because there was a much larger black population in the South during that time. So sort of before the Great Migration, I think like 70% of blacks lived in the South. It might have been even larger than that. So because the black population was so large in the South, it has to be larger than that. It's got to be almost 90% of blacks are in the South during the antebellum period. So there would have been more passing in the South during that period, because there would have been more racial mixture in the South during that period. But what I really try to show is that passing is really a national phenomenon. So a lot of people make the assumption that passing is something that really happened mostly in New Orleans, or it's really something that happened mostly in, other port cities where you had a lot of intermixture and where you had a lot of people kind of coming and going in a very transient population. But what I really want to show is that it happened everywhere. It happened in Keene, New Hampshire. That it's not just the places that we kind of would expect or the places that we would assume you'd find passing, that actually, it could happen really, really, really anywhere. But thank you.
Thank you.
I'll have to get up more now. Thank you for telling me that.
Allison, we're just about out of time, so this is going to be our last question.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Hobbs, my question is, due to restrictions, on the size of your book, were there stories that you had to leave behind?
Oh, yeah. It's funny. There were lots of stories that I had to leave behind, and there were lots of stories that I had to just write about very briefly. And it was really, really hard. And my dissertation advisor, who's a really eminent historian, Tom Holt at the University of Chicago, we sort of had a joke about it where, there would be a story that I just absolutely loved, and he'd be like, okay, I know you love it, but like, that's not, that's like, you've got to get to the stories that really prove your argument and really, make your point. So, there are tons of really interesting stories. There's one story about a man named Harry S. Murphy, who is very light-skinned, and he applies for a program to be part of the Navy. It's sort of like a predecessor to the ROTC. And when he goes, he meets with the registrar, and they immediately write him as white. And he gets his card back, and he's like, "Oh, okay, well, I guess I'm white now," And he's like, I didn't say I was white. I didn't, but this is the way this person saw me. And this happened a lot in the military, because, someone is looking at someone else, and they're making a decision based on their own understanding of race. And then once you have this official document that has your racial identity as white, well, that's going to set you on a whole new path in terms of your life chances. So, interestingly, Harry S. Murphy is sent to, of all places, Ole Miss. It's the University of Mississippi. And this is I think he's there in the 1940s. And basically, this is in a moment where, you know, Ole Miss is priding itself on over 100 years of being this lily white university. And here's Harry S. Murphy, and he's having the time of his life. He's dancing with white women. He's running on the track team. He actually even participates in a protest against Theodore Bilbo, who was, you know, the fanatical segregationist who comes to Ole Miss while Harry S. Murphy is there. I think Harry S. Murphy is there 1944 to 1945. And, you know, he's described by people as being arrogant and a loud talker. So it's not like he's trying to keep a low profile. I mean, he's like, I'm here. I'm going to have the time of my life as, you know, a student at Ole Miss. And interestingly, his story comes out when James Meredith tries to integrate Ole Miss. And Harry S. Murphy says, you know, they're fighting a battle that they have no idea that they lost years and years ago. So I really wanted to say more about him. I think that's such a fascinating story, and there's these great old pictures of him holding his Ole Miss student ID card, and you know, so I would have loved to delve more deeply into his story. I mean, so that's just one example of a lot of stories that, you know, I just could only mention very briefly, but would have loved to say more about. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you all very much. Thank you.